Welcome back to the Privacy Report. We're the show that digs into the latest developments affecting your digital autonomy. Today, we're looking at something seemingly small, but actually quite profound. The shift away from physical SIM cards to embedded eSIMs. It's sold to us as pure convenience, right? No more fiddly little cards, instant setup, managing multiple lines easily. But like always, convenience often has hidden costs. And here, it seems to involve giving up some physical, tangible control.
That really is the heart of it, isn't it? I mean, both technologies do the same basic job. They authenticate you, get you onto the network. But how they do it, well, that changes the power dynamic quite a bit. The big question we're exploring today is, when you get rid of that physical token, how much control over your identity and location do you, the user, actually lose? And conversely, how much more oversight do carriers and vendors gain?
Good question. And just a quick reminder, if you want more analysis like this sent directly to you, you can subscribe to our email newsletter over at theprivacyreport.net. Okay, so let's unpack the basic difference here. The physical SIM card, that little chip we've all handled for years. It wasn't just plastic.
Exactly. It was a physical thing holding your credentials, your keys to the network.
Ah.
And that physical nature gave you a couple of really important things. Portability, you could pop it out and put it in another phone instantly. And, well, destructibility, if you needed to cut ties completely, you could literally just destroy the card. Game over for that token.
Right, so now compare that to the eSIM, the E standing for embedded.
It is, yeah, it's fundamentally different. The eSIM is a tiny chip, but it's soldered right onto the device's motherboard. It's prominent hardware. So instead of swapping cards, you download a carrier profile over the air or OTA. Think of it like downloading your phone number and plan digitally instead of plugging in a physical key.
And you have to admit, that OTA part sounds fantastic for a lot of people. You land somewhere new, activate a local plan right away, or you run work and personal lines on one phone without juggling tiny bits of plastic. The convenience is undeniable.
Oh, absolutely. The convenience factor is huge. But as you said, losing that direct physical control over your identity profile, that's what really changes the privacy game.
Yeah, and that brings us straight to maybe the biggest privacy point, this idea of losing that layer of anonymity or disconnectability. We used to be able to just pocket the SIM, right? Turn the phone into just a piece of hardware not connected. How does the permanent eSIM affect that?
It makes achieving true isolation much, much harder. With the physical SIM, if you really wanted to go off-grid, you took the card out, maybe stored it somewhere safe. The phone was inert, network-wise. The eSIM chip, though, it's always there. Even if you disable connectivity through software settings, the chip itself, its unique identifier, and potentially the stored credentials, they're still part of the hardware. It's just technically more difficult to be absolutely sure nothing is being stored or potentially recoverable by the device or its OS later on.
And wasn't there also a way that physical SIMs offered a kind of purchase privacy too?
There was, yeah, especially in some places. You could often, walk into a shop, buy a prepaid physical SIM, maybe pay cash, activate it with fairly minimal ID checks, particularly with those MVNOs, the mobile virtual network operators who rent network space. That offered a degree of anonymity for people who needed or wanted it.
That feels like a bit of a relic now, doesn't it?
It really does, because activating an eSIM nearly always requires an internet connection to download that profile. And that download is usually triggered by a QR code or logging into an account, things that are already tied directly to your verified digital identity with the carrier. So that digital handshake needed to get the profile onto the chip. It tightens the link between the device, your real identity, and the carrier's records right from the get-go. That old anonymity loophole is closing fast.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting for me. We've talked about the physical identity aspect. Now let's talk about the metadata trail. When the whole activation process is digital server to server, what does that imply for data logging?
Well, it potentially means a much richer stream of metadata for the carrier and maybe even the platform providers involved in that provisioning, simply because the whole thing is software-driven now. Think about it. When you physically swapped a SIM, that action, pulling one card, putting another in, was invisible to the network until the new card actually connected. But now, because eSIM provisioning is all digital, they can log incredibly detailed metadata about the process itself. Like every time you switch between different eSIM profiles on your phone, that's a logged event, time-stamped. They know which profile was activated, when, possibly linked to your account, maybe even which one it replaced.
Oh, so it's not just logging your calls or data usage anymore. It's logging the the admin life of the identity token itself.
Exactly. This gives them a new level of oversight. They can potentially track the specific device model using the profile, detailed usage patterns tied to that specific digital profile, the exact moment you switch profiles. Information that was much harder, maybe impossible to get reliably when you just held the physical key.
Yeah, let me just play devil's advocate for a second here. Isn't this just modernizing things? Carriers already log tons of data. Is this truly a fundamental increase in their oversight, or just a smoother way to log stuff they could kind of already access?
That's a fair question. I'd argue it is a fundamental increase, maybe not always in the type of data, but certainly in the immediacy and the completeness of the tracking related to the device's operational state and identity management. The very seamlessness of that OTA download gives carriers and vendors more real-time oversight over the entire life cycle of your connection credentials than they had before. Why? Because they're managing the credential file directly, remotely from start to finish. It's not just monitoring the connection enabled by the credential. They control the credential itself now. It inherently centralizes power away from you and onto their servers.
Right. Okay, let's pivot to security then, because that's often touted as the big win for eSIMs. Proponents will say, correctly, that because it's embedded, you don't have the risk of someone stealing your phone and just yanking out the SIM card, or those older, simpler types of SIM cloning attacks.
And they're right. That is a genuine, significant security benefit against those kinds of local physical attacks. eSIMs are very resistant to that. The remote provisioning process usually involves strong encryption, too, making it harder for a casual attacker to just sniff and copy your credentials over the air. But, and this is a really big but, that security gain comes with a massive trade-off: the centralization of risk.
Explain that. Why does making it remote and digital create this big, new, centralized risk?
Well, think about it. With physical SIMs, you had millions, maybe billions, of individual, physically separate authentication tokens out there. To compromise your identity, an attacker usually had to target you specifically, maybe through phishing, tricking you, or physically getting your card. With eSIMs, the ability to issue, update, delete, or reassign those digital profiles rests with a relatively small number of centralized remote provisioning servers. These are run by the carriers or sometimes global platform vendors. So instead of millions of individual front doors, you now have a few major digital vaults holding the master keys.
So the risk shifts from lots of small individual targets to one massive high-value target.
Precisely. If someone, whether it's criminals or even a state actor making a demand, manages to compromise one of those central provisioning systems, they could theoretically tamper with, disable, or reassign user profiles on a huge scale and do it almost instantly. That's a systemic risk you just didn't face when the physical token was primarily under your control.
That's a really interesting paradox. It protects you better from the small-time crook trying a SIM swap.
Exactly. But it potentially exposes everyone using that system to a much larger, though perhaps less frequent, systemic threat if that central system gets breached.
Okay, that synthesis is crucial. So, pulling all this together, the anonymity aspect, the metadata, the centralized risk, how should someone decide which to prefer, assuming they even have a choice anymore?
Well, if your priority is operational anonymity, or the ability to completely physically disconnect your device's network identity, or maybe rely on the flexibility or specific plans from certain MVNOs, the physical SIM still offers distinct advantages. It gives you a layer of control that's hard to replicate purely in software.
Right. But on the other hand,
If your main worry is those common SIM swap scams where someone tries to steal your number by tricking the carrier, then the eSIM being embedded and digitally managed does offer a stronger defense against that specific type of attack.
so the ideal might be a phone that supports both, gives you options.
That really seems like the best scenario, doesn't it? The convenience of eSIM for your mainline, maybe, but keeping that physical slot for travel, temporary numbers, or situations where you want that tangible control. But unfortunately, we're seeing fewer and fewer devices offer that choice. And that trend itself is maybe the key takeaway here: the erosion of choice. As the big manufacturers phase out physical SIM slots, users are essentially being nudged or pushed towards a model where connectivity is managed in a way that inherently gives more oversight to vendors and carriers, less autonomy for the individual.
And that loss of choice itself becomes the ultimate privacy issue, really. If the tech dictates the terms of oversight, rather than you choosing based on your needs, the whole definition of a private connection starts to shift under our feet. It really hammers home that the best defense is still awareness. Understanding what data your device is sharing, how your connection is actually being managed. The real power isn't just in the SIM itself, whether it's plastic or code, but in who controls the system behind it, and whether you still get a say. Which leaves us with a final, maybe slightly unsettling thought to chew on. If connectivity becomes entirely managed by these embedded, remotely provisioned chips, what's next? Could we see a future where activating even basic network access requires linking directly to, say, a government-issued digital ID, effectively making anonymous connections a thing of the past, globally, establishing a default linkage between identity and connectivity? That's definitely something to think about next time you set up a new device.
A critical thought. Yeah, thanks for joining this conversation, everyone.
Yes, thank you for tuning in to the Privacy Report. If you found this valuable, please do remember to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps others find the show. And just a quick note, this episode was created with the assistance of AI.